Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Carrie Drummond, and I'm a marketing coordinator for Ansible here at Red Hat. Today, we're excited to share tackling big IP blue-green deployments in private cloud using F5 and VMware Ansible modules, presented by Payal Singh from F5 Networks and Eric McElroy from the Ansible team here at Red Hat. Before we begin, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees of the webinar are on mute. Questions will come up during the presentation, and we ask that you use the questions panel and type your question in there on the control panel. We'll answer some of those questions throughout the webinar. We'll type responses to you, and at the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many questions as we can out loud. We are also recording this webinar, and the link to that recording will be shared with you in the next day or two. So be on the lookout for that. And finally, as the Ansible Fest event manager, I do want to just give a quick shout out that we're hosting Ansible Fest 2018 in Austin, Texas on October 2nd and 3rd. And we're excited that F5 is sponsoring the event again this year. We've got an entire network automation track at the conference. So if you're interested in joining us there, please take advantage of super early bird pricing going on right now. That's your best chance to get a discount on a ticket. And you can check out ansible.com/AnsibleFest for more information. So now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Eric McElroy, and I'm just going to start out by talking about what overall the automation journey looks like. So the agenda today is going to be, we're going to talk about some networking automation use cases to get started, and then we're going to move into the F5 Big IP introduction, the blue-green deployment use cases, a demo, and a playbook walkthrough by Payal. So we're going to really get deep into how this works and how F5 and Ansible come together to really make it possible to use not only hardware-based items, but cloud and VMware-based presentations as well. So moving on to the networking use cases today, it's really more about the journey that you're on. So you're starting from the very beginning. So what you're trying to do is start very small, and you're gathering information. So you're pulling down information from your actual devices and things like, your pool members, your system information for opening tickets with F5 or anything along those lines. It really allows you to gather all that information from your F5s and break them up into certain specific locations, such as system, pool members, VIPs, whatever it is that you're trying to pull in, you can really pull that in. And the great thing about that gathering of information to start with as your first use case is to really, you can utilize that later on as you move through your journey through utilizing F5 and Ansible. Because what happens is you can save those facts as variables and then use those variables in your changes, which leads us into our second use case, which is making a change. So you want to move in from gathering information, so that way you can make sure that your source of truth is correct and your network isn't just your source of truth anymore. You can pull that information down and save it off to your GitHub and GitLab or into any of CMDBs that you may create using the Ansible and F5 modules, especially the F5 Big IP Gather Facts modules that allows you to gather that information. Once you have that information and you want to make a change, so you want to start small, and you really want to do things that are very easy to make changes to, such as disabling, enabling node members so that you can patch them, or something small that's non-disruptive that you can, build your confidence in not only the modules of Ansible, but how Ansible and F5 work together. So then you're going to move into making a change. So that may be as simple as adding a new node to a pool, adding a VIP to a pool, is something along those lines, using the resource modules that are out there. And there's over 90 resource modules currently. And this applies to the cloud environment because the VEs for F5s act the same way as they would from a hardware perspective. So you're really able to control your entire F5 infrastructure using Ansible with these modules. So you're moving to that, making a change, and you're doing something small. You're making a node member disable or enable, or you're moving it to a new pool, or you're adding in node members. You're doing these small items that allow you to get the feel for and get the confidence behind the modules, that you feel that they are doing what you want them to do. You are able to get the results that you're looking for in an automated fashion. And once you have that under control, you now went from gathering information to making a change, and now you want to look at scaling out. And using Jinja templating and IApps, you're able to really scale out your production ready items very quickly using those IApps and those Jinja templating, because you could take and template out your entire VM stack, for instance, and say, I need 3 VMs with these IP addresses, and these are the variables that I want to pass through to the IApp that's going to be deployed, and I'm able to push out an entire application stack from beginning to end. I can push out the the pool, the members, the VIP, the rules that apply to the actual pool, all of those ratios and other things, and any rules that apply outside of that, all within the comfort of one playbook that'll just allow you to spin up and tear down in the same manner, because all you're doing is reverse. Once you're deploying that IApp, is you're removing that IApp. So it really allows for that scaling ability. So really your top use cases that you're working through are gathering information, you're making your changes to get really, to get started. And then from there, really scaling out to really build and grow your application development, and allows you to control those big deployments. So you can spin up, a 10 node server, 10 member nodes to a pool, and then have all of that information built into that Jinja template that will pass through the IApp and allow you to make that huge change in a relatively quick, fast manner. And like I said, this applies to your hardware and and then your virtual environments, your cloud environments, any environments where the big IP infrastructure allows you to control your load balancing. You're really able to do that through the Ansible and F5 nodes that are modules that have been created, and really gather that information, build that change, and then scale to the proportions that you see fit. And really, that's the start and end of your journey. Well, there's never really an end to the journey, because you continue on. You're always automating something new, something more, something better, something new, and changes. So as you go from a hardware-based environment to a VMware-based environment to a cloud-based environment, you're always able to take that same information that you've created and utilize it over, but it allows you to do it in a manner that you're always growing and building on and able to control your different systems. And that gives you a general idea of getting started with Ansible and the use cases that you can really get started with through gathering your information, you're making your changes, and you're scaling it out to your larger deployments. And from there, we're going to go into our main discussion today with Pael. Go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Eric. That was really good information on some of the most common automation use cases with respect to F5. Just my quick introduction. My name is Pael Singh. I'm a principal solution engineer with the business development team at F5 Networks. And, we at F5 have a great working relationship with the Ansible team, who really help us understand the value of network automation, as well as guide F5 on developing our automation strategy. So before I go deeper into the webinar and talk about our specific use case, I just want to start by giving a brief introduction on the F5 technology for some of you who might not be familiar with it. So if we look at the diagram here, we have our big IP, what we call it, our hardware box. And ideally, the big IP can be a physical or a virtual form factor. So in the physical form factor, we do have an appliance and a chassis, and we also have a virtual edition of the big IP. Now, the big IP has a number of modules that you can provision, and the LTM, which is our local traffic manager, is the most popular module that's offered by F5 Networks. And the real power of the LTM is really its full proxy capability, where a user has entire visibility into client as well as server connections, and they can augment and manipulate those connections as and when needed. So having this insight into these connections is what helps the big IP LTM make informed and intelligent load balancing decisions based on availability, performance, as well as persistence. Now, the APM and the ASM are basically under our security portfolio. The APM stands for our Access Policy Manager, And it is a secure, flexible, and high-performing solution that provides basically unified, centralized access to your network, cloud, and applications. So it helps you protect your data against loss, malware, and basically rogue device access. Now, the ASM is our Application Security Manager, which is also basically our WAF. And what our big IP ASM provides is visibility into your HTTP and WebSocket traffic to protect you against the attacks that basically blend in with your normal web traffic or your streaming data feeds and chat sessions. Another module or another functionality that Big IP provides is DNS functionality. We're going to talk a lot more about this module and how this module enables us to do global load balancing as we move on in the webinar. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what the Big IP has to offer in terms of feature and functionality. And I would also just like to recap what we have covered in the previous webinars that we've had with Ansible. A lot of what Eric spoke about, the automation use cases, is what we have covered in our previous webinars. We have spoken about how you can develop a basic F5 playbook to gather facts or to add virtual servers and pools. We've spoken in depth about the different Ansible and F5 modules that F5 is developing. We have covered how to onboard the Big IP and also how to deploy L4 to L7 configuration using a Big IP technology called IAPS. Just a quick definition of IAPS, it's a template that's provided by Big IP to deploy your application. So you have a template where you provide in the virtual server, the pool, the members, etc., and you deploy that template. So behind the scenes, you do not need to tell Big IP on how to deploy it. You just need to tell Big IP what you want to be deployed using that IAP template. And you can deploy IAPs by using F5 Ansible modules. The last webinar we had was focused on Ansible Tower. What are the features and functionalities and how we can use Ansible Tower to provision and deploy F5 Big IP. So we're going to, just keep in mind the data or the content that we covered in the previous webinars, and that will really help you better in grasping the content that we're going to cover in today's webinar. So moving on, let's talk about the F5 and Ansible solution, right? So F5 has really simple DevOps and programmable goals. The goal is to make it faster and easier for customers to basically deploy and consume our Big IP application services. Now, may it be the Big IP hardware platform, or may it be the virtual edition, or may it be the location of the Big IP? Is it placed on-prem in your private cloud, or is it placed in your public cloud? So the goal is to make it easy for users and customers to consume our Big IP application services, and also provide a consistent automation framework. We do not want different users, or we do not want to burden the users of having to develop their own scripts for doing the most common automation tasks on the Big IP. And this is where Ansible really helps us. It's simple. You do not need any ASIS, you do not need any agent to be installed on your Big IP. All you need is an SSH connection, and you are able to automate the Big IP. It's really easy because the playbooks are written in YAML format, and YAML is human readable. Just by looking at the playbook and looking at the tasks, you can say exactly what is going to get configured on your Big IP. And having these different F5 Ansible modules gives a great uniform interface to all of the users to deploy the common tasks. So you have different modules, and you can customize the modules to develop your own playbooks, which is going to represent your workflows. So we have F5 Ansible modules starting from Ansible version 2.3. The latest Ansible version is 2.6. So if you download Ansible today, F5 modules are part of that. You do not need to download anything externally to get Ansible working with F5. The only two packages that you need to be installed is a package called BigSuds and F5 SDK. Both of these packages are managed and written by F5, and the install is as simple as doing a pip install on these packages. And the third nuance is the big IP version has to be more than 12.x. Having said that, your playbooks, if you run them against 11 or a 10, they might work, but if you encounter any issues, they're not going to be looked at or fixed by F5. So the recommended and all the testing that happens from F5 is on the 12.x onwards. Now, a special mention about the F5 Ansible modules, they are now officially supported by F5. So if you have any issues while running your playbooks on a particular module, you can go to the F5 support page and open a support ticket, and that will be handled by F5. So, just to kind of clarify, if you have a customized playbook, that is not going to be supported by F5. But if you hit an issue for a particular module that you are using in the playbook, like if you pass in XYZ parameters and you're hitting an error on an exception, that is definitely going to be looked at by F5. So we have a number of modules that cover a lot of use cases. And today we're going to talk about a use case for blue-green deployments. We're going to walk through a demo and see the different F5 Ansible modules that we have used to achieve this particular use case. Now, a lot of you might have heard about blue-green deployments. That's probably come up in your conversations. But if I were to give a simple definition for a blue-green deployment, it's nothing but a technique that is going to reduce your downtime and risk by running two identical production environments, right? One called the blue environment and one called the green environment. At a particular point in time, all your traffic is only being directed towards one environment, in this case, your blue environment, whereas your green environment is a backup. So if anything has to go wrong, you want to switch your traffic from your blue environment to your green environment. Now, there are different ways to basically achieve switching traffic or basically maintaining or managing your blue and green environments, right? If we talk about a load balancer, and if we look at all the traffic coming into a particular virtual IP on a load balancer, we have a pool sitting behind the load balancer. We have a pool sitting behind the virtual IP. Now, you could have two different sets of pools representing two different environments. So you could have a blue pool and you could have a green pool. Now, if there are any concerns with the blue pool, all you have to do is switch the virtual IP to point to the green pool. And at that point, you have achieved your traffic switch from your blue to your green environment. Now, that is one way of managing your deployment. Another way is having an entire different blue and green environment in different data centers. And at that point, when you want to switch traffic, you want to switch the traffic going to a new virtual IP and not really going to a new pool member. And that can basically be achieved by using our F5 Big IP DNS. So consider it as a global load balancer. So if we were to look at this particular workflow, say you have users that want to access your data that's sitting in your blue environment. The user is going to go through your DNS. The DNS can be, again, it can be hardware or it can be a virtual edition. And at this point, your DNS is pointing to your big IP, virtual IP sitting in your blue environment. Now, you can have the DNS set to do load balancing, global load balancing based on different algorithms. But here we are talking about a specific use case where all of the traffic is going to the blue environment and we want to switch it to the green environment. So another place where the DNS can be used is also to do geographic load balancing. So you can load balance based on your topology or your geography. And the DNS can also do load balancing based on infrastructure monitoring. So once you have your big IP LTM and your big IP DNS set up to communicate and talk to each other, then all of the LTM VIP health statistics visibility is present into the big IP DNS. So by seeing the LTM VIP, is it available, is it down, maybe it has too many connections, the DNS can make intelligent decisions whether it still wants to pass traffic to that particular virtual IP, or it wants to maybe send traffic to a different virtual IP. But as I mentioned, in this use case, we are going to start by the big IP DNS pointing all of its traffic to one virtual IP that belongs to the blue environment, and then we are going to switch over to the green environment. Now, going a little bit deeper, taking this topology in mind and going a little bit deeper to see into the configuration that's done on the big IP DNS as well as the big IP LTM, we have the users who basically access a wide IP. Consider it as a URL, right? I want to be able to access data that's residing behind that URL. Now, behind this URL is sitting a pool of members that is going to serve that data or serve that request. And behind this pool, we have right now two members, the LTM1 virtual IP, which is the blue environment, and the LTM2 virtual IP, which is the green environment. But you can consider the green environment as dormant right now because we want all of our traffic to be going to the blue environment. Now, the wide IP, the pool, and the members that are assigned to the pool, this configuration is done on our big IP DNS. So the LTM VIPs are assigned to the pool on the DNS, but they are not configured on the DNS. The configuration of the virtual IPs and the pools and the members is done on the big IP LTM. But once you establish a trust between the LTM and the DNS, the VIPs are visible into DNS, and then you can use those VIPs to add to the GTM pool or the big IP DNS pool. Now, once you have this kind of setup or topology, when you want to switch from your blue to your green environment, you could either get the VIP down, you could get the pool down, you could get the big IP down, however you want to disable the blue environment. And at this point, your DNS is automatically then going to point your traffic to the green environment. So at this point, you've achieved a traffic switch, and you have very less downtime when you switch your traffic. So keep this topology keep this topology and call flow in mind while we go through the webinar, because this is the entire workflow that we are going to see how to automate it with F5 and Ansible without any manual intervention. So talking about the demo, it's going to be split into two parts. The first part is how do we provision, license, bring up a virtual big IP in your VMware environment. Now you can consider this basically as your green environment. So right now we have no green environment set up. We only have a blue environment. So the part one of the demo is going to spin up your green environment, and part two of the demo is then basically going to switch from your blue environment, your LTM1, to your LTM2 VIP. So the part one of the demo, we're going to go through an automated workflow to provision, license, as well as configure a big IP in your VMware environment. So we have a playbook that is executed through your Ansible tower, and the first step is spinning it up in vCenter. Now there is a big IP VE template that's already created on vCenter. The template has absolutely no configuration on it. It's a blank template. But when we use the playbook to spin it up, we are going to clone a big IP from that particular VE template. Once we have spun it up, we are going to reconfigure the network adapter settings on the VE to basically change what network do we want the management of the big IP to belong, what network do we want the client as well as the server traffic to belong to. After we reconfigure the network adapter settings, then we are going to grab the IP address that gets assigned to the big IP VE. And in this case, we have DHCP enabled. So the big IP is going to get an IP address that's assigned by DHCP. Once we grab the IP address of the big IP, then we are going to go ahead and license the big IPve. We're going to provision the big IP with LTM and ASM module. So ASM, as I mentioned, is our WAF module. So we are going to set up a WAF policy on the big IP, and for that we do need the ASM module. So once you license the big IP, provisioning means you have it licensed, but you still need to enable those modules on the big IP in order to use the features that are provided by that module. Now, after we provision the big IP ASM module, we are going to onboard the big IP, which is information like hostname, NTP, DNS, SSHD, etc. We're then going to network the big IP with VLANs and self IPs. And then we're going to import and activate the ASM policy. Now, this ASM policy, we are not going to create a new one on the big IP, but we are going to grab an ASM policy from GitHub. We're going to upload it to the big IP. We're going to activate it, and we're going to finally assign it to a virtual server. So after we import and activate the ASM policy, we're going to go ahead and create the pool members and the pool, and then create a virtual server and attach the ASM policy to it. So I'm going to switch my screen to a video, which is going to go over the execution of the playbook as well as the playbook walkthrough. So I'm going to go into full screen. So all of the playbooks are executed using Ansible Tower, and the job templates to execute these playbooks has already been created. Now, the playbooks, as I mentioned, are placed on GitHub. So a project has already been added on the tower, which is pointing to our GitHub. And once you assign that project to a template, in the playbooks, we get a drop down of all the playbooks that are available on that particular GitHub, and we can choose which playbook we want to execute for this particular job template. So here we have a spin up a VMware.yaml. Now within the job template, there's also a functionality on Tower to be able to add a survey to the job template. Now, adding a survey is like providing variables that are needed as input to the playbook. So in our case, we have added certain variables like when we spin up the VE in vCenter, what is the name of the guest that we want to give? What is the big IPve template that we want to clone from? What is the license key that's used? What is the virtual server name that we want to spin up, as well as the virtual server IP and port? So these are just some of the variables that we are passing through the survey. There are different methods with which you can pass variables to a playbook. It can be through a survey, it can be through a flat variable file, or it could even be variables that you're passing within a playbook itself. Now, when it comes to the survey, you can also give default values to the parameters that you are passing. And you have the option to change these default values. Now, once you save the survey and you're going to launch this particular job template, it is at this point that you will be prompted for the survey again. And right now it's filled in with all of the default values, but you do have an option to now change what you want from the default values. So in this case, simple, we're just changing the guest name from its default value. Now we go ahead and launch the template. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen where the extra variables box is there, that is all the values that you basically passed into the survey. And these are going to be used as input when your playbook is going to get executed. Now, the first task of our playbook is to spin up our big IP in VMware. So if we look at what's getting configured on the vCenter, we do have our demo tower big IP 001 being cloned from the template that's already present on our vCenter. Once we have this cloned and spun up, we are going to reconfigure the network adapters. If we go back to the vCenter, that task is executed and we have reconfigured the network adapters. And the next task is to basically wait for the IP address to get assigned by DHCP to this particular big IP. So as you can see right now, there's no big IP assigned. And as it is booting up, it's going to get an IP address assigned to it. Now, right now you see there's a 192.168.1.245 IP address assigned to it, which is the default IP address of our big IP VE image if you do not set it up through DHCP or you do not set up a static management IP. But we do have DHCP enabled, so before it gets the final IP address, it does in the interim get this particular IP address. So in our playbook, we are going to wait till it gets the IP address that's going to be assigned by DHCP. So as you can see, for this particular task, we do have a retry because it is waiting for the correct IP address to be assigned to the big IP VE. Now, if we check the IP address that we've gotten through the playbook, we have the 10.192.73.246, which is the IP address that we expect out of the DHCP range. Now, once we have the IP address, we can do all the further tasks on our big IP. So the first task is to basically license the big IP using a license key. Now, as you remember, we did pass in the license key through the survey. So that is the key that it is going to use to license the big IP. After it licenses the big IP, then it's going to provision the big IP with the appropriate modules. In this case, LTM and ASM. After it provisions it, we're going to onboard the big IP and configure the network. As I mentioned, NTP, hostname, SSHD, DNS settings, VLAN, self IPs. All of these are right now getting configured on the big IP. And after that, we are going to create our ASM policy. We are going to grab our ASM policy, upload it on the big IP, and basically activate that ASM policy. Once we have imported and activated the ASM policy, we are going to then basically add the nodes, the pools, as well as the virtual server to the big IP. And to the virtual server, we are going to attach the ASM profile. So the playbook right now has completed execution, and let's go see what gets configured on the big IP right now. So if we take a look at the big IP, the IP address here is 73.246, which is the one that got assigned by DHCP. We look into configuration, we have the onboarding parameters configured. We have it licensed with the particular modules, LTM and ASM. If we go into network, we have the VLANs and the self IPs. If we go into the security tab and look at the policy, we do have our demo ASM WAF policy, which has been activated and uploaded. And once we go into the local traffic tab into the network map, we see this virtual IP, the pool, as well as the pool member that's assigned to that particular pool. Now, also having a look at the virtual IP, if you click on the security tab, we do see the ASM profile has been assigned to the virtual IP. Now, going back to the virtual IP and taking a note of the IP address, it's 10.168.68.12. Now, let's make sure this works and test traffic to it. So once we hit that particular IP address, we get a response from the pool member that's sitting behind that VIP. And here, since we are simulating the green environment, the background is just green to make it easier to understand. Now, we also want to test our WAF policy. And in our WAF policy, we have defined that if we try to go to a URL called block.html, then the WAF is going to block that particular URL. So if you try to go to the VIP and block.html, we get a response that the URL was rejected. And this is a standard response by the Big IP ASM module. This can be customized and changed by the F5 administrator. So at this point, we have our green environment, which is up and ready to take traffic. Now let's have a look at the playbooks that we basically use to achieve this call flow. So these playbooks are available on GitHub. As Carrie mentioned, this webinar will be available in a day or two. So you will have the links to all of the playbooks where they are placed at, and feel free to have a look at how we are using these playbooks in these particular workflows. So having a look at this particular playbook, we do have a variable file included to pass parameters that we did not pass through the survey. So information like what was the NTP IP address or the DNS IP address, what was the host name, the VLAN, the self IP, that information we passed in through a variable file. In this playbook, we also have defined some of the environment variables. These environment variables are useful because if you have a number of tasks in your playbook, you do not want to repeat what is the F5 username, password, and port that you're using. So you can define them as environment variables. We also have environment variables defined for GOVC, and I will talk about what that is as we go through the playbook. Now, the first task, as we know, was spinning up a big IPVE from a template. And in this case, we use a module of vSphere_guest. So this is this is an Ansible VMware module. And here we did specify a template. And when you specify a template, we used a parameter called template_source to provide the name of the template. The next task was to reconfigure the network adapters. And again, here we use the vSphere_guest module in order to do that. If we scroll to the bottom, you can see the different NICs and the different networks that we assign to the NIC. After having the network reconfigured, we wanted to grab the IP address from the big IPVE. Now, here is where we are using a tool called as GOVC. The reason being that the big IPVE does not have the standard VMware tools. So if we use the vSphere_guest module and try to grab the IP address, we get a blank IP address. We don't actually get the value that's been assigned. But using a GOVC tool, we can run a command as shown here, the user local bin, GOVC, and get the IP address that gets assigned to that particular big IP. And as I also mentioned, the VE goes through a couple of iterations before getting assigned the final IP address. And that is where we are checking for the range of the DHCP. So we are doing a loop and we are retrying this about 50 times to be able to get the correct IP address. So after we grab the IP address, we assign it to a variable. And once assigned to a variable, then we can use it for the remaining of the playbook. Now, we also have a really good module called as the big IP_wait that waits for the big IP to be completely ready and booted up to take on more requests. So things like when you license it or when you provision the big IP, it might go through a restart. And if you have those modules being used, then it's good to use the big IP wait after those modules so that if it does go through a restart, it is ready before you pass in the next command to it. Now, after we know that the big IP is ready, we license the big IP using a license key using the device_license module. As I mentioned, we make sure the big IP is ready after the license is installed. We provision the big IP with the various modules using big IP_provision. And then we onboard the big IP. So the different modules used here are device_NTP, big IP_hostname, big IP_device SSHD, and also big IP device DNS. After that, for networking, we use the big IP VLAN and the big IP_self IP. And then we deploy the ASM policy. To deploy the ASM policy, you do need an LTM policy to be configured. So these three modules are required if you want to upload and activate an ASM policy. So the three modules here are BigIP_policy, BigIP_ASM policy, and BigIP_policy rule. Now, finally, we create the nodes, which are basically your pool members. Then we create a pool using the BigIP_pool. We add the pool members to the pool. And then we create a virtual server and we attach an ASM profile to the virtual server. Now, these are just some of the parameters that you can pass through the BigIP_virtual server module. There are a lot more parameters that you can provide, and you can look at our F5 Networks GitHub to see what are the different parameters that are supported for different modules. Now, as you can see, it's really simple to understand what this playbook is configuring. Just by looking at the name of the module, you know what is getting configured on the F5 and what are the different parameters that you are passing to this particular module. Now, this brings us to the end of the part 1 of the demo. And I'm just going to switch back to my slide deck to talk about what we are going to cover in part 2 of the demo. Now, part 2 of the demo is going to talk about how to establish trust between this LTM that we have spun up and our DNS, and then how do we switch traffic from the blue to the green environment. So have this topology in your mind where you have your DNS, it's listening on an IP address of 68.101, that is listening on port 53. So if any client were to make a request to a URL, that URL would be resolved to an IP address using 68.101. And behind that DNS is sitting a pool. And right now that pool has only one member in it, which is your LTM1 VIP, which is your virtual IP 10.168.68.11. Now, what we did in part 1 of the demo was that we spun up a BigIP VE from scratch. And now what we are going to do is establish trust between this spun up BigIP and the DNS, and then also add it as a member in the pool. Then we'll disable the blue environment and see how all the traffic is now being directed to the green environment. So switching back to the video, this is the part 2 of the demo. And here we are using two different playbooks. We are going to use one playbook to run a couple of CLI commands on our BigIP DNS, which are used to establish the trust between the BigIP LTM and the DNS. So we have a template created, and we are going to launch this particular template. And this template is called as run GTM commands, which is basically run global traffic manager commands. So once this is executed, we are able to establish the trust. So looking at what basically we did through this particular playbook is we created a shell script to run the BigIP_add command. As I mentioned, there are two commands that we need to execute on the BigIP DNS. One is called the BigIP_add and one is called the Big3D install. Now both these are needed. One is to establish the trust, and second is to have the REST framework on both the BigIP and the BigIP LTM and the DNS to be in sync with each other. Now, one way of achieving this through an Ansible playbook is to create a shell script to run the BigIP_add, because it does expect to pass in a password once we run that CLI command. And the second is to create a config file and have your strict host key checking set to no. Because when it asks for that particular question, do you want to trust this host, yes or no? We just want to avoid that particular question so that our automation is, we do not have any roadblocks in automation and we do not need to do any manual intervention. So once we have these two scripts that have been created, we copy these over to the BigIP GTM using the Ansible copy module. we provide the source, and we provide the destination of where we want to copy it. And then we go ahead and execute the shell script, which is going to execute the big_IP_command CLI. And then we also execute the big3d install CLI command. So after this playbook has executed, we have established trust between our LTM and DNS. Now, before moving on to talking about the next playbook, let's quickly look at what is configured on the DNS right now. So on the DNS, we have the wide IP, and behind this wide IP is sitting a pool, and behind that pool is sitting a member. Right now, the member that's sitting behind the pool is the blue environment. So that's 10.168.68.11. So we have only one member. So if we go ahead from a client and we do a NS lookup, we are going to get the response for that particular URL to be 68.11. And 68.101 is the big IP DNS listener. So if we were to try to access the wide IP, right now we get the response from our blue environment. Now let's go and execute the final playbook, which is going to, this playbook also asks us for some of the parameters that are needed to execute the playbook, like what is the big IP address, which is the virtual server that you want to add to the DNS pool, and which is the virtual server that you want to disable on that particular pool. So once we launch this and the playbook executes successfully, let's go and see what gets configured on the big IP DNS. Now, when we go back, this is the pool member. Initially, we had only LTM1. Now we have LTM2, which is our 68.12, and our LTM1 server has been disabled. So right now, all the traffic will go to your LTM2, which is your green environment. So now if we do a NS lookup on that particular wide IP, as you can see, it gets resolved to 10.168.68.12. And when we try to access that particular URL, we are going to get a response from the green environment. So at this point, we have achieved our traffic switch. Let's look at the playbook that was used to achieve this. Now we are passing in some of the variables through the playbook itself. Now the big IP_GTM server is the first F5 Ansible module used in this playbook to basically add the LTM server into your big IP DNS. Once it's added, we wait for a couple of seconds so that the GTM can grab all of the information from the LTM. Once it is able to see into the LTM and gain visibility, then we add that particular LTM into the GTM pool. And once it's added to the GTM pool, right here we are disabling the virtual server on LTM1. So all we do is use our big IP virtual server module, give it the name of the server, and basically have the state as disabled. So this brings us to an end for the demo and the call flow that we are trying to cover for this use case. As you can see, it is zero touch. There is absolutely no manual step that was involved, right from spinning up the green environment to doing a traffic switch. Now, before I conclude the technical part of this webinar, I just quickly want to touch upon a few alternative solutions. So we did use DHCP to assign a management IP address to the big IP, but if there is a use of assigning a static management IP, that can be done as well, but you do need a big IP version of 13.1. Now, how you can do that is, when you have the 13.1 OVA file, you can edit the properties of the OVA file using a tool like COT. And what you add in this OVA file is your management.address, your management.network, your root password, and your admin password. So you've added these properties to the OVA file. And when you basically spin up this OVA file, you can provide the values for the management IP, the gateway, and the passwords that you want to send when that big IP is spun up. So to basically spin up this OVA file, you can use Ansible playbooks to execute the deploying of the OVA file, which is your step 2. So your step 1 is more of a one-time effort where you want to edit the properties of your OVA file, and then you can use an Ansible playbook to deploy this OVA template and pass in the different parameters. So this is one way of assigning a static management IP to the big IP. There are example playbooks that are placed at the link they mentioned in step 3. Now, another alternative solution is licensing. If license key is not appealing enough to use, you can use BigIQ, which is our centralized management platform. And besides doing other things, it manages licensing on the big IPs. So in this case, what you would do is you would have an Ansible playbook, which you can execute through Tower against the big IQ. So we do have F5 Ansible modules for the big IQ. And once you execute that playbook, it would then go ahead and license your different big IPs. So all you need to know is one base registration key, which is the key that you've added on your big IQ. And that is what you would pass in the playbook. So you do not have to know 10 or 20 different license keys. You know one base registration key, which is on your big IQ, and then you pass in the playbook to basically configure or license your big IP through your big IQ. Now this brings us to the end of the technical side or technical content of the webinar. And the next few slides really are going through all the different resources that we have available if you are interested to get started in automating F5 using Ansible. So, automation, as we know, it's not really one tool. It's a strategy. It's a journey. It depends on what role you are in your company. You might be a QA tester, a developer, or a network administrator. And based on your role, you're going to have different automation needs. So really, before you dive into automation, a good strategy is to look into what you do repetitively on a daily basis and what makes sense for you to automate. To learn about how to automate F5 in general, we have a great training called SuperNetOps. You can go to f5.com/supernetops and learn how to automate the F5. There are a lot of Ansible network automation communities to learn about Ansible. And, as Eric mentioned, to get started, create small playbooks, start small, just read some content from your device, and then create complicated workflows using your playbooks. So we also have a lot of workflows on something called as Ansible Galaxy. Ansible Galaxy is Ansible's community site where you can upload different roles, and roles basically represent different workflows which you can reuse. So think of roles as reusable code and reusable workflows. So for Big IP, we have a couple of roles that we have uploaded to Ansible Galaxy. You can just download this role and get started. So some of the workflows that we've covered is like onboarding, adding a virtual server pool member, deploying L4 to L7 parameters using IAPS, and also setting up an HA pair. So if you do have a repetitive task of setting up your big IP in a high availability cluster, you can use an Ansible playbook to achieve that. And that example is present on Ansible Galaxy, and it's also mentioned as a link in this particular webinar. Other resources and FAQs, if you want to learn more about Ansible and F5, ansible.com/F5 is a great resource. It has the recordings of all of our previous webinars. It has solution briefs. It has white papers. If you want to learn about the roadmap or see what F5 is developing, then you can go to our F5 Networks GitHub that has all the information there. And besides these resources, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to the email address provided there, or even getting started at ansible.com. Someone will definitely get back and reach out to you. The next two slides are just, again, a lot of references that we have, which will help you in understanding more about the solution. On the last slide, I have just summarized all the links to the different playbooks that we have used and talked about in this particular webinar. So that's what I have for today, and I thank you so much for joining the webinar, and I hope this webinar encourages you to try how to automate your big IP using Ansible. And if you are already automating, I hope you learned something new. And if you do have any interesting workflows that you automate on big IP, feel free to reach out to us to let us know what your workflows are, or if you are okay, you can even go and upload them on Ansible Galaxy and let us know that you've uploaded some content. So, thank you. Before passing the ball to the Ansible team, I would really like to thank the Ansible team for hosting this joint webinar.
Well, thank you so much. That was really great. We really appreciate you walking us through that, and especially showing us the demos. I know that we're short on time here, but we do have just a couple minutes if anybody has a question they want to drop into the questions panel. And I also just quickly want to say we got a question about getting a copy of the presentation, and you will get a PDF of the slides along with the recording of the webinar probably tomorrow. I've just got to edit the recording and get it uploaded for you. All right, we'll see. We do have one question in here that says, can you please show the flat file that gets created from Ansible Tower and feeds the playbook? I'm not sure if that's something that you can show right now, or if it's something that we need to follow up with that person and send them something after the webinar.
Yeah, I could send it to them after the webinar if they can just shoot me an email. The flat file, I'm a little confused. Is it the actual playbook that's up on GitHub? But if you're talking about the variables that get passed into the survey, there is no file, that physical file that gets created. The variables are just used as is in the playbook.
Oh, okay. And they did clarify and say that they meant the variables. So thank you for answering that one.
Sure.
Anything else before we go? I'll wait just another second to see if any more questions come in. And like I said, we will send out an email to everyone with the recording and a copy of the slides. Oh, we got another question in here. Does Ansible have any similar types of training? So, if you're talking about more webinars just like this, definitely check out our webinar listing on Ansible.com. We've always got something going on. And I know that Red Hat does also offer Ansible training, and there's also a specific network training as well. And all of that's on Ansible.com. All right, well, I think that'll do it. Thank you so much to Payal and to Eric, and thank you to everybody who was able to attend. Please stay tuned for the recording, and probably tomorrow we'll get that out to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie.